Alright, so finally, let's get started on this box. The longer I leave this, the more I forget how it goes together, but it is pretty simple. I've kind of left things laid out as I've pulled them out. It'll come together kind of once I get my head back into it. It's been a couple of weeks since I pulled it down, but what I'm going to do, I'm going to basically follow what the service manual says, or their procedure. As you remember, if you saw the teardown video, I pulled it apart a slightly different way because it was an absolute bitch to get the rear bearing off the main shaft. So it's this rear bearing here behind 5th gear assembly. So I kind of did it a different way and kind of got the counter shaft out so that I could then get the whole main shaft out and press it off on the press instead of trying to use a bearing puller to, you know, effectively try and get it through. Okay, so the first things to do, obviously, as you saw me do previously, I've already checked the run out for the main shaft, so that was with the dial indicator. When Ben was here last, we marked this dimension here, checked that, and the rest of the bearing seat dimensions. That was all in spec. Main shaft is all good. This is all just being cleaned up. I've just Scotch-Brighted all the surfaces, everything's looking good. As I said, it's all in spec, so I'm happy to use this main shaft. So there are different main shaft lengths, as I probably mentioned in the previous video or earlier on in this video, I'm not sure. But this is from the R150F, which is from the Hilux, whereas the R151F main shaft is probably 100mm, 90mm longer, which is on the Land Cruisers, like the HZJ and maybe FZJ potentially. But nonetheless, yeah, if you're going to be doing an R151 swap or whatever, just keep in mind that there are differences. The main case is the same, all the gears and everything as far as I can see are the same. The synchros slightly changed, but it's as much of a muchness, it's just a different design. So I guess we'll follow this through and start building this up. So one thing I'll show you just before we go too far, another thing to check is obviously synchros. This is probably one of the main ones to check because obviously you don't want to put a box together and have crunchy gears. So I'll use the kind of input shaft one, which is 4th gear essentially. So that is the synchro ring, that bronze there. So obviously the first thing is to do a visual inspection. I don't know if you'll be able to see it on the camera, but there is actually some ribs inside that. So obviously if they're kind of worn out, that's the first sign. The other thing is to obviously inspect the surface of the cone that this synchro basically clamped onto. So it's essentially just a taper, so it pushes onto the taper and gets to the point where it kind of locks up, and then that slows the gear down so that then it can all mesh and change into that gear. So yeah, obviously first visual inspection, both the cone and the actual synchro ring. These ones look really, really good. So the main kind of telltale thing to check upon deeming it visually okay is to check the clearance. When you've kind of got it nice and seated, you can check the clearance between the brass ring and the back of the gear. So get a set of feeler gauges. The spec that you want to see is between 0.8 and 1.5 mil. So from memory, these were like 1.1 or something like that. So we've still got definitely a bit of meat left. So it might even be more. So yeah, this input shaft assembly is all good to go. Synchro is good, the gear is good, and the bearing is also good. So I'm just going to skip the first step in the manual, which is obviously assembling this, and then we'll move on with the next step. So this is obviously pretty simple. It's just a snap ring and a bearing. Pretty basic stuff. You should know what you're doing with that. Okay, so let's get started. Obviously we've got the brand new counter shaft. So this is a shaft that needs to be mated with the R151 main shaft, because obviously these gear ratios all need to match up. And basically these main gears set up the cluster ratio. So the front two are the cluster ratio essentially. So what we've got to do first up is press a new bearing onto this, which I have got, which is this one here. So as a quick reference, I'm just going to use the old broken counter shaft. So you can see that obviously the circlip groove goes to the outside. That's pretty obvious, but just just take note of that. If I was reusing this counter shaft and it wasn't broken, I would probably just reuse this bearing because it feels pretty good. But I figured to save me fucking around trying to get that off and potentially damaging it, for 10 bucks or whatever it was when I ordered all the rest of the gearbox parts, I'll just get a new bearing. So go to the press and we'll put this on. And for all my bearings, I'm going to be using some mounting paste. So this is some stuff that Ben gave me. As you've seen in other videos with Ben, like diff builds and all that kind of stuff, he gives you guys the kind of industry lowdown on bearing installations, and this just makes things go on a bit nicer. It stops kind of fretting corrosion and all other kinds of stuff. So I'll be using that on all my bearing surfaces. Right, so you can see I've got the mounting paste on the surface and obviously checking which direction the bearing goes. There is a little thrust washer that goes on first, so I'll pop that on, that's all in. And then just get that started. So this has a center ring and a 27mm socket works really nicely for this. I'm just kind of holding the outer bearing up against the inner part, just so that when it goes in, I know it's all going in true. It's not going to bind up against one of the bearings. It doesn't take much pressure to put this on. So there we go. That's on there. And now we need to find the right size snap ring. So chances are you could potentially use the snap rings that came with the box that you're building, but what I did when I was on Parts Hook is I ordered, so these are how you basically set all the clearances on the bearings and the end float of the shafts. So for each bearing, as you can see, I've gone through, labeled where they go, and I've got all the different sizes. So this is the counter shaft front, so as you can see it'll be one of these snap rings. So I've just got to find the right width and put it in. So what I've done is I've basically ordered the sizes that I had and then everything bigger. So that one there is pretty bang on. So that is the 23060. So I think that's like the next size up from what I had. So that's a nice fit. I'm going to put that in. Another thing to be sure, there is actually an orientation for these. So there's a slight angle of the opening of this circlip, so you want that to be kind of facing that way, so that when you want to take it off, your pliers want to stay in it and not slip out. So another thing to check when you're doing these. And obviously you want to try not overstretch them as well, so just bend them as much as you need to. So, and then a good indicator that it's in is that you can basically give it a tap and it'll rotate around. So that now is nice and tight, and that gives the minimal axial play. Okay, so that's the counter shaft ready to go for now. That's obviously the easiest shaft, so we'll put that aside. Now it's time to get started on the main shaft. So I wish I had another vise, because it's kind of good to hold this upright so you can stack everything up on it. So a bit of a spanner in the works. I just came over here just to check, just to be sure, the input shaft length, because the other R150 that I pulled apart was the same length as this one, which is the R151 input shaft. And lo and behold, it is about 25, 30 mil longer than the one that came out of the surf. So it looks like I'm now going to have to pull this one apart to take this input shaft out, and thankfully that bearing feels good, but I kind of wanted to keep this intact, mainly just because it's a simple fix up for it to be good again, and also just to use as a visual reference for building this. But I guess I'm going to have to do this now. Okay, so I've got the input shaft out of the old box, and I'm glad I did, because basically the bearing on this looked a bit shitty, so I've pressed it off and I'm going to swap it with the good bearings from the other one. But when I did so, I actually realized that the oiling hole for the bearing on the inside here was blocked, and also the little hole for the gearing to this gear right here, the helical gear, that was also pretty well blocked up with shit. So that's kind of worked out well, because I managed to do all this, press it all off, cleaned up, and now it's ready to put the new bearing back on and pick up where we left off. And while I got them here, you can see the two different length shafts. So I'm not sure what exactly is going on, but I'm measuring this from the base of the cone for the synchronizer to the end of the input shaft. So this one's about 225 mil, this one's 254, 255. So this was the 105 series R151. This is the Surf's R150F. But then the other R150F I had this input shaft, so I'm not sure what's going on there. Maybe the V6 is longer as opposed to the 4-cylinder. Might be the case, but that's them. Alright, so the plot thickens. So this is the third gear that came off the broken box, obviously judging by the smashed gear there. So I was just looking at this with the new third gear, and there's a slight difference. Can you see the difference? These slots here, don't have it on this gear. So this setup is a different type of synchro arrangement. Basically, thankfully I've got a spare box, so I've actually got the cone for this one. So I can't be bothered waiting another week for, well, trying to find this gear and then waiting a week for it to come. So I'm just going to kind of run with this. All the stack height and everything is the same, so fingers crossed that there won't be any issues. Well, this is turning into quite a fucking shit show. Because I'm going to have to use this hub, this synchro is literally right on the limit of kind of acceptable wear. So I'm kind of in two minds what I do here. So this is 0.6, so that's the absolute lowest limit that they say in the repair manual. So I might go check out the one that I've got on the box from the Surf and see if that's any better. Alright, so I think I know what's going on now. There are obviously some slight variations between different boxes. So what I've found out, basically I've just pulled my box, well, the box is out of the Surf, that is now pulled apart. Over on, I'm running out of bench space to pull all these boxes apart. But basically what I've noticed is the input shaft for the Surf, as I mentioned, is shorter. So I've had to take that off. Thankfully that's all good. I swapped the better bearing onto that, took the one that was on that off and put the one from the 151 input shaft on that. Checked the thrust, it's all good. Synchro is good for that one as well. Obviously that's shorter, maybe the V6, because the other R150 I had is out of the V6 4Runner. So obviously that's got the longer input shaft, which is the same as the HZ 105 series as well, I think. And then it comes to the synchros. So the third gear on the 151 is a different assembly. Obviously this gear is crunched, so it's no good. The ratios for third are still the same between 150 and 151, so that's good. I did buy a new third gear, but I can't find any synchros that have a good enough fitment on them. So what I've done, thankfully I pulled that box from the Surf apart, because upon inspection the third gear that I had is in good condition and the synchro is good as well. So that's where I'm at. Hopefully these annoying little anomalies don't keep cropping up. I just want to stack up the gears on the main shaft really. It's now 2 o'clock, I started this at like 9 o'clock in the morning, so don't have much to show for it. I'm worried there may be some differences when it comes to the main center plate and like the shift fork levers and everything, but we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. The main thing is if we can get the main shaft loaded up and the counter shaft, well, the counter shaft just sits there. There's some gears on the back, but that's about it. Fingers crossed. Okay, so we can finally get on with this. This gear is all degreased and nice and cleaned up, and I just sprayed some oil on it whilst I went and got some lunch. So what I will do is just scuff up the cone, that the synchro ring bites on. I'm just using a bit of Scotch-Brite. It's a good idea just to do this to all of them if they're used gears, because sometimes they kind of get a bit glossy and shiny, and obviously that doesn't grip as well. So that grips nicely, and I can visually see that it's a much bigger. I think I measured it about 0.9 mil, which is within spec. It's a lot better spec than what I had with the new third gear and the old synchro ring, which was like 0.6, which is on like the kind of outer limit. So this is all good. Obviously you want to make sure that all your oiling holes are clean. Clean the gears up as best as you can. I've also cleaned this bearing up as well, so this is all ready to go. It's looking pretty good. I don't think you'll really ever have trouble with these unless you've done something wrong. Just put a little bit of gear oil in this, so that can slip on there, and then third gear slips over that as well, so I've still got some on my fingers, so I'll just put the inside of that. There we go. So what we have to do as well is obviously put the synchro hub on. So these hubs go a certain way. You can see, well, hopefully you can see there is this side's kind of got a chamfer on the front edge, whereas this side is square. So the square face, which you can actually see a bit of a witness mark from the thrust loading, that goes against the gear. So this will need to be pressed on. So we'll get that started, and we'll take it over to the press and pop this on. Alright, so I've got this set up. Make sure that when you're setting it up, it's obviously sitting on the inner kind of ring of the hub, not just the outside. And we can start to press this bad boy on. So the thing is not to press this all the way. This has got to have a little bit of clearance. So we're looking for, I think, 0.1 from memory. Okay, so with this driven home, there's one thing we've got to check, which is the end play. So the manual specs anywhere from 0.1 to 0.2, I think. So that's 0.1 mil there, and that fits. It's probably about 0.12, I'd say. Is 0.13. Yeah, so we're sitting about 0.13 mil of thrust. So that's good. So that's set there. Now we've got to find a snap ring that fits on the other side, as we've done with the countershaft prior. Alright, so this second ring is looking pretty good. Remember to face these the right way. There we go. Let's check that that's seated with the pin punch. Yep. That's looking good. So for those of you playing along at home who have been wondering maybe how a synchro works, I'll show you guys basically what it does. So obviously this is third gear, for instance. This spins freely on the shaft. So with the gear spinning, put some weight on the shifter, and then the fork obviously comes and pushes this closer. It locks the gear up, slows it right down, and then it slows it down enough so that the hub can slide over and lock that gear. So now this gear is locked to the shaft. So effectively that's how the synchros work. Very basic. And then they click back, and then that gear can free spin. Alright, so next up, obviously we've stacked the front bit. It's time to stack it from the rear. So this is the second gear. This is from the R151. This gear is all in good nick. As you can see, I've cleaned it up. Happy days, everything looks good. All the kind of thrust surfaces don't look too worn, and as I already said, this is in spec. So This goes on first, obviously same thing, this bearing, so we'll just put some oil in this. So there we go, that's all nice and lubricated. So this gear, make sure everything's clean obviously. This can just go down over that now. There we go, happy days. So the next thing is the selector hub. So this is the one from the R151. This has got the different synchro arrangement. They appear to all be like this on this box. So I'm just going to keep running with most of the stuff from the 151 because I think it's a better setup. Obviously my third gear's from the 150, but much of a muchness. I'm not pulling these synchro hubs apart just because I know they're in good nick, they look good, and yeah, all round I'm just generally happy with how they are, and obviously it saves time. So I've cleaned all these out. I might actually go give it a final flush out with some degreaser just to make sure there's no bits of particle left in there, but yeah, you can kind of see how the ring comes apart. You've got like an inner ring and then the kind of intermediate friction ring, then you've got kind of an outer brass ring. So that's the synchro arrangement basically, and then the hub itself's pretty basic. So these ones are different because they've got like a spring-loaded kind of, I don't know what the technical name is, but it's like a spring-loaded kind of seesaw toggle in there, whereas the older style, they have the traditional circlips on opposing sides. So again, I'm just going to scuff up this kind of intermediate plate for the synchro, just take any of the shine off it. Okay, so be sure to obviously put this the right way. So the easiest way is, you can see this lip here, that goes down towards the second gear. And you can also, I don't know whether they're all going to be like this, but you can see that there's the kind of relief line here where the center has been pressed in, whereas on the outside here there's a thrust face. So what we'll do is obviously load everything back up. Alright, so now the synchros are all cleaned up. I'm just going to put a bit more oil through this pack. So these can drop on here. You can see where they lock in. That centering locks into there. So that's all looking good. And then obviously we can just press this onto here in the press. Alright, so now we grab our special service tool, aka a length of 40 NB pipe, and we can press this on. So I've just got this shaft resting on the snout of the main shaft, so that's about all you can really rest this on. Well, it's the most substantial anyway. So I'll put a bit of pressure on this. So the only other thing we've got to make sure we get right is the orientation of these slots for the synchro ring. So there's two different slots that we have to line up. It's going to be very hard to show you, but there's the ones that go up into the counter bore, and then there's the other ones that line up with the gear itself. So I think we're looking pretty good there. I'm going to keep an eye on them. So that should be good. So we'll slowly bring that in. Alright, so that should be home. And then there we go, that's working. So that can spin, put a bit of pressure on that, locks up, and then shifts into second, so that's good. And you can see, same deal as last time, that's pushed home. I will check the float on that as well, but we've got to find a snap ring for that. So I'll go and find that and I'll be back in a sec. Okay, so I've just got it lightly clamped in the press. So in the instructions, it just says to select a ring that allows minimal axial play. So for those of you who don't know, axial is along the axis of the shaft, and radial is, I guess, in the direction of the radius, if that's the best way to think of it. So that's got probably 0.1. It doesn't actually give a spec, This is obviously pressed all the way home. So to me that, well, we can't really change anyway, but to me that's good. So the key thing is now just getting the snap ring that fits the best for that. So I've got a couple here, we'll have a look. So we'll start off one bigger than what I had before. So obviously you just kind of put it in there, give it a bit of a twist. That's fitting nice and snug, so we'll run with that. So this is where it's handy to have this kind of clamped up in the press, because these you got to basically hammer on, which is a bit of a bastard. So there we go. That's looking good. Moving on to the next one. Okay, so it's same thing again, basically. This one has a spacer, so second gear, the first thing is this little, I guess it looks like Teflon spacer, so that goes on, that basically spaces it up off that snap ring that we've already put in. So this synchro arrangement is the same as the last one, so I'm not going to show you that again because it's the same thing. I've just cleaned them all up as I did with the previous one, so now it's just a matter of replicating what we did before, but pressing this on, and then yeah, we're pretty much there with the main shaft. So there we go, that slips on nice and easy. So the next thing is this thrust washer, and then also the little detent kind of ball, not a detent, but I guess locking pin, locking ball. So we've got this little pin here that slots into the main shaft. I'm probably blocking your view. My God, my fingers are too fat. There we go. So that goes in there, and then obviously this thrust washer will just sit over that, and that's locked that in. I'll just put some oil on that as well, obviously. And then the next thing is the center bearing for the output shaft, which is on this collar here. So we'll take it back over to the press and we'll put that on. Okay, so I've got some more mounting paste on the surface where the bearing's going to ride. Obviously things to check is that the bearing is pressed on the right way, so you can see the snap ring groove. That goes towards the back of the box. Pretty straightforward stuff. Now my special service tool is probably going to be just too short to take this all the way, but I'll see what I can do. Alright, here we go. I just made up another special service tool to add on to this. Alright, so that bearing's pressed on. I've just clamped it back up in the press because what I've got to do is check the first and second gear clearances. So again, it's 0.1 being the lower limit and 0.45 is the upper limit. So 0.45 is the upper limit for first and 0.25 is the upper limit for second. So let's see what we got. So second gear there is probably 0.13. I'll try 0.15. Good. Okay, so first gear, it's a bit of a tricky one to get in there, but you got to kind of get it between the gear and the thrust washer. But that's pretty good, and that's at 0.2. So I'd say it's probably 0.25. Yeah, it's probably 0.23 of clearance. So that's kind of in between the lower and upper limit, so I'm happy with that. All right, so I might as well leave this on the press. Next thing to go on is 5th gear. So again, this is all cleaned up and that will pop on there. And then this spacer goes on. So what I will do is, I guess, press this on first. So thankfully this is a pretty loose press fit. I do see people saying that when they swap to the Dyna 5th gear that sometimes they're hard to get off, or sometimes they just literally pull off. I can tell you in the 3 boxes that I've pulled apart that I've got here, all of them were pretty well pressed on. The hardest part is the rear bearing, which you would have seen in the pull down video. So if you're going to be doing the Dyna 5th gear, I would advise pulling the whole box out and building it properly like this. It'd be an absolute pain in the ass trying to do it in the car especially. So that's that. Then the next thing to go on is this spacer. So this will be interesting to see basically how it is measured in spec. I put a tick on that so I knew it was this one. It'd be interesting to see how things go with the rear bearing and this clip. Obviously I've got all different size clips, so we should be okay. You obviously want to have that a nice tight fit. In the 151 that I pulled apart, it probably had 0.6 mil, 0.7 mil play, close to a mil I'd say. Actually I think from memory it measured about 0.7 small, so yeah. That was probably one of the reasons why 3rd got smashed potentially. So we got a brand new bearing for this one. Otherwise I'll just put a bit of mounting paste on the seat. Just helps this all go together. And whoever pulls this apart next will thank me as well, because it'll also come apart easier. So what I'm going to do is just spin this round so I can basically rest the bearing on the plate and then press the rest of the shaft down onto it. Alright, that went on a lot easier than it came off. Alright, so now I've flipped this shaft over, much like the other times, and got this clamped up in the press. I was trying to open this bloody baggie with slippery, oily hands. I'm going to take a punt and see what this snap ring fits like. Oh, it's probably a fracky too tight. Next one down. No dice. Alright, that one will just fit. So I think that's probably a size up from the one that came with the box. There you go. That is the main shaft complete. That looks really nice. Brand new, and yeah, let's go put it in the intermediate plate. Just going to put a little bit of bearing compound on the inside of this. Alright, she's getting some weight to her now. There we go. Beautiful. So then the next thing to do is install the snap ring. So these ones are pretty light, as you'll probably remember if you've pulled them apart. I need to get myself some better snap ring pliers because these are shit. There we go. And obviously always check just by rotating it in there. That kind of just shows that it's home. So that's that. Main shaft complete. So now the next thing we're going to do is install the input shaft. So as you saw prior, this has already been cleaned up. We've got the little needle roller that goes in as well. So a bit of oil on that. And we plonk that inside the input shaft. And then obviously the synchro as well. Just put a little bit of oil on that as well. Alright, so I'm just going to slap the synchro in place there so it locks in. or not. I'll put that on here then. So again, already inspected, all good. That will slip on there and just rotate round until it locks into place. That's it there, it's looking good. Alright, so let's give everything a check. So obviously this is in neutral, essentially. So fourth gear, this will push over and lock that, that's good. Then third gear, push over and lock that, that's good. Then second gear, over there. Then first gear there. So everything's looking good. I'm just going to put some more oil down in these synchros, just to make everything that bit more messier. Happy days. Alright, so the next up is to put the countershaft in. So just a bit of bearing compound on there again. And then I've got a new bearing for this as well. Just going to use some of this oil and put it inside the bearings here. So they're saying in the manual to throw this through. And then we push the bearing on from the back side. Oh yeah, that works. So you can see there, that's the bearing at the back. Obviously with the new bearing it came with a snap ring on it, so I just left it on there so that stops it where it needs to. And yeah, that's all that. Alright, so I've just put my magnet in to pull the D10 ball out so I can get this arm out, because I need to do that to get this lever back on, because this came off. When I pulled it off, I took it off after all this was out, so I actually can't get it back in without doing this. But what we're going to do now is put this bracket on here, and this gets torqued up to 18 Newton meters. I'm going to go to 25 because I feel like 18 is not much at all. And these are M8 bolts, so they're normally good for at least 20. But that feels super loose. I don't like that, but oh well. So then I think the next step is we slip this under here. That's got to be captured in there. And then we slide this through. So if you're using a magnet for this, once the detent, well, it's actually not a detent, it's a interlock bearing. So once that's in, if you kind of twist that so it holds the interlock, then you'll be able to pull the magnet out without pulling the interlock pin out as well. So that's that. That's on there. So I'm guessing next up I've got to put the reverse idler and gear shaft on. Alright, so reverse idler, I think this just slips on through there like so. Here we go. Something like that. Alright, so now with the idler in, we can put this backing plate, so that just slips in like so. So that, hopefully you can see that just locks into the idler pin, as you probably remember as you pulled it apart. And then these get torqued to 18 Newton meters as well, which is fucking stuff all. So I'm gonna go 20 odd again. Alright, so it's time to install the fifth gear. So I've got this little pin to put in the shaft. Hopefully I can do this with my fat fingers. Here we go. So then we got the thrust washer which goes on that. So now we've got the thrust washer on. Obviously it's time for the bearing. So this is a split bearing, as you probably remember. Insert that as per se. So this is all good to go. That will just slip on here now. or not. Alright, so that's all on and feeling good. So what I had to do there, I had to just take the top section of the split bearing off because it was coming down and catching on this lip here. So obviously make sure it's all in. It obviously won't go in unless it's right, but just something to check. So that's all good. So I forgot to put this ring on. So there are some flats. Well, on this particular setup, there's obviously two different ones. There's these type of synchros and the other traditional synchros, as I've said before. So on this one, there's a few flats across the way. So you can see there's a few longer kind of keyways. So you just got to line them up. And also the thicker edge goes towards the back. There we go. That's on there. The inward kind of facing flange obviously goes that way. So I'll just put a little bit of oil on that. So the only other thing we've got to line up, there's 3 holes in this. They have to line up with the 3 tangs on that synchro. Alright, there you go. First time lucky. Beautiful. So the final check is just the 5th gear thrust clearance, which I can tell that's probably about 0.15. So I'm not going to bother trying to measure that because I know it's in spec, because feeling off all the other ones, that's probably better, I'd say. So happy days. Testing, testies. Okay, so it's time for all this shift fork assemblies. Okay, so we've got this lever assembly on. So what we've got to do is drop this ball bearing. You'll see there's a little slot there, so that ball bearing will sit in there like so. So next up we got obviously the 5th gear, and we need to put this shaft in and connect up to this. And also the interlock pin is right down onto the top of this shaft, so make sure that's in. So this will twist in like so. So when you do it, you've got to make sure the indents, there's I'll try push it through. See how there's indents here? So they need to be facing obviously this for the detent spring. So we'll just line that up, and then we can tap the roll pin. So it's got the roll pin. We've got the interlock between these two, so that's all good. So the next up, we're going to drop the next interlock in. There we go. And we've got this one, which should slide through here. So as we're bringing this one in, we've got to put the interlock pin, this little small pill-shaped one, in there. And we can drop the big kind of interlock in. That's good. Just got to rotate that round till it drops in. And we can send this fella through. Alright, so now we can pop our side kind of locking balls in. We'll get some sealant for these plugs. Then we've got the top one. And of course we got the circlips. Well, this has turned into a bit of a pain in the ass. I was a bit worried about this, using like the R151 shift levers and all that stuff. I think I've just found an issue. So when obviously I'm in 5th gear, so yeah, 5th gear, you can see how close the 5th gear selector is to the rear bearing. And just looking at the case and how it fits, this bit here is almost definitely going to hit. So, So I think I'm going to have to pull this apart again and put the 5th gear from my box on, because it is shorter by the looks of it. Yeah, so it's about 10-12 mil shorter by the looks of it. Oh well. Well, that wraps up how to build it. Obviously there's quite a few different variances between these boxes. I'm finding out the hard way, unfortunately, but that will be showing you guys what to look out for, hopefully what not to do. So it's getting late, it's like 8 o'clock at night now. I've been kind of fucking around with this for so long, and just checking everything over just because I'm not sure what's cross compatible or whatever. Obviously we've found that. Nonetheless, that is how you build your R150, R151. Lots of different variances, but the core things are kind of the same. So the best advice is take note of how everything was when you pulled it apart. Take plenty of photos so you can refer back to it, because like the instructions I've got are different to the box that I'm building. They're very similar, but like the shift levers and just some little details are different to what I have in real life, so I've had to kind of figure it out and look back on photos, which I had, thankfully.